Every horror fan remembers the moment a scene crosses the line from scary to unforgettable in Welcome to Derry. Episode 4, that line is a priest's chest ripping open and a blood-drenched infant in a crown of thorns crawling out to kill. But here's the thing, scenes that bold aren't random. This wasn't shock for shock's sake. It was a message, a layered symbol rooted in history, religion, trauma, and the very nature of it. And tonight we're gonna decode it. Let's be extremely precise. The sequence occurs within an origin flashback centered on Seski and her people. The show's version of Derry's pre-colonial history, the Galoo, the series' ancient entity attacks. The creature manifests as a missionary or priest in the flashback. That priest form leers, then, in a grotesque subversion of birth imagery, his chest splits, and out comes a small, stabbing infant figure wearing a crown of thorns. That infant stabs Seski and mortally wounds her. The scene ends with the survivors using star shard talismans to wound and temporarily contain the being, seeding the ancient conflict that makes Derry haunted. To understand the image's meaning, you need the episode's metaphysical rules. The show rebrands the cosmic it as the Galoo, an otherworldly presence tied to a falling star native characters, and the flashback use carved star shards as weapons and talismans. These shards wound the entity enough to create a kind of ritualized containment. That's crucial. The Galoo is not merely a shapeshifter for cheap jump scares. Its shapes are purposeful and tied to history, psychic fear, and offense. In other words, the forms the Galoo assumes aren't random. It chooses material that will have maximum impact on its targets. That concept is a through line throughout King's work and every adaptation. The monster wears the faces of real terror. Okay, now the meat. I'm going to give you 4 layered interpretations. These aren't mutually exclusive. The image is dense enough to support several truths at once. For each, I'll show the evidence inside the episode and explain why it matters. The strongest reading is political. The priest form is a direct symbol of colonial missionaries, and the baby Jesus inversion is an indictment of religious harm evidence. The attack happens in a pre-colonial context where the threat of incoming settlers and missionaries would historically be the existential catastrophe for indigenous people. The Galoo, adopting a missionary guise, weaponizes the very figure that historically used salvation to justify dispossession, and then literalizes that harm by having a twisted Christ kill horror, often externalizes historical trauma as monsters. Welcome to Derry is following that tradition. The crown of thorns on the baby is key. It's a Christian symbol turned into a weapon. That inversion reads as a critique. The very institution that claimed to save people brought suffering instead. Second reading is that the baby imagery is horror shorthand for corrupted innocence. A baby is culturally associated with pure vulnerability. Horror flips that on its head constantly. Think of creepy dolls, possessed infants. When the safe becomes dangerous, the shock hits harder. By making the stabbing figure an infant, the show weaponizes the instinct to protect children, turning audience empathy into disgust and terror. So the baby is effective both narratively and viscerally. It's not merely about religion. It's about making something sacred grotesque to distill emotional disgust and surprise. The third is the crown of thorns. That specific symbol invokes Christ's passion and sacrifice. There are 2 plausible spins. One, it's a direct mockery. The creature imitates Christian iconography to twist the town's spiritual language into violence. 2, the crown is a ritual or sigil the Galoo uses, appropriating powerful religious imagery to exact a cultural wound. So which of those is correct? Evidence inside the episode leans toward mockery. The crown appears attached to a brutal, stabbing infant, not a sacrificial savior. The show wants the audience to recognize the symbol and then feel its corruption. That corruption reinforces the colonial reading. Religion presented as salvation becomes a literal instrument of death. Fourth is that it's canonical it behavior. In Stephen King's work, the creature manifests as the form that will cause the most personal terror to its prey. That principle scales to community fear. The Galoo becomes, for Seski's people, the worst combination of colonizer and perverse savior. So the priest-to-baby sequence is not modestly aesthetic, it's dramaturgic. The Galoo does what it knows will wound the community most. This reading ties together the first 3, colonial history, infant inversion, perversion, and religious mockery are symbiotic here, so where are we? The scene is dense but coherent. It uses the priest form to summon colonial associations, the baby to invert innocence, the crown to pervert Christianity, and canonical, it rules to make the attack targeted. Those are the strongest interpretations, and together they paint a picture. The creature weaponizes the language of salvation to destroy a people. Now for the pushback. Some viewers say the sequence is primarily a shock moment, aggressive CGI, and grotesque body horror intended to get clicks. They point to moments in modern TV where surreal visuals land uneasily and argue that strong symbolism is being read into an effect that's mostly stylistic. That criticism has two components, aesthetic and interpretive. Aesthetic, yes. People debate whether the visual effects work. Interpretive, even if the CGI is imperfect, the writers still chose the imagery. Intent is decided by creative choice. The show could have made the Galoo a generic monster, but it didn't. Choosing a priest and crown of thorns is deliberate, so even if the execution falters, the symbolic weight is present. Also remember, great horror often uses ugly or uncomfortable visuals to force conversation. The debate itself acts as an extension of the scene's power. To better understand the scene, put it in genre context. Horror has a long history of using religious iconography to question institutions, from possession stories that critique religious impotence to colonial horror that literalizes historical violence. Welcome to Derry sits at that intersection. The show blends Stephen King's cosmic dread with contemporary cultural critique. The Priest, baby sequence is the latest example of horror making visible the invisible harms of history. Also, by connecting the Galoo to the star shards and ritual containment, the show frames its conflict not just as supernatural, but as historically anchored. That's what gives the image its narrative teeth. What does this moment do for the rest of Welcome to Derry? Three things: narrative motivation, moral context, and emotional resonance. Narrative: it gives the series a reason to have the town haunted. The Galoo was wounded and bound. Derry became a physical site of that wound. Moral context: the show implicates the systems that enabled the Galoo's domination, colonizers, religious institutions, and indifferent power. Emotional: by tying the monster to real historical wounds, the series raises the stakes beyond individual fear. Now it's communal memory and trauma. In short, the image is less about a one-off gross out and more about setting a thematic tone. Derry's history is stained, and the monster uses that stain. So what do I think? Taken together, the strongest reading is that the Galoo uses the missionary figure and the perverse baby Jesus to literalize colonial and religious violence, turning the language of salvation into an instrument of death. That reading gives the scene gravity beyond gore and ties it to the show's broader myth. But the image is powerful because it works on several levels at once: political, psychological, and visceral. And that's the story inside the story. The hidden meaning behind one of Welcome to Derry's most unsettling images. A priest, a crown of thorns, a newborn turned nightmare. Not random, not shock, but a symbol crafted to show us how fear, history, and belief can twist into something monstrous.